Chapter 1. A woman who ruled as king. More than 3,000 years ago, in a land where every pharaoh was expected to be a man, a woman put on the crown of Egypt and ruled as king. Her name was Hatshepsut, which means foremost of noble women, and for around 20 years she governed one of the richest, most powerful states the ancient world had ever seen. She did not rule from behind a throne or in someone else's name. She took the full titles of pharaoh, built temples that still stand today, and sent a famous expedition to a distant land of myrrh and gold. In her own statues, she had herself shown in the regalia of a king, even with the ceremonial false beard pharaohs wore. And then, long after her death, someone tried to erase her. Her name was chiseled from her monuments, and for centuries the world forgot she had ever lived. This is the true story of how she rose, how she ruled, and how history slowly, stubbornly, remembered her again. Chapter 2. New Kingdom Egypt. The Age of Empire. To understand Hatshepsut, you first have to understand the Egypt she was born into. Not the dusty stereotype of pyramids alone, but a confident empire at the height of its powers. Historians call her era the New Kingdom, which lasted from about 1570 to 1069 BCE. And it was a golden age of wealth, art, and ambition. A century or so before her birth, foreign rulers, known as the Hyksos, had controlled the north of Egypt. They were driven out by the princes of Thebes, and the kings who followed built a true empire, pushing Egypt's power south into Nubia and north into the lands of Syria. Gold flowed in from the desert mines, tribute and trade goods flowed in from abroad. At the heart of it all stood the city of Thebes and its enormous temple of the god Amun at Karnak. This was the world Hatshepsut grew up in, rich, proud, deeply religious, and freshly aware that its security depended on strong kings and watchful borders. Chapter 3. The Role of Pharaoh. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was far more than a ruler. He was the living link between the people and the gods, the one person responsible for keeping Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth, balance, and justice, from collapsing into chaos. When the Nile flooded on time and the harvest came in, that was the pharaoh doing his sacred job, because the role was wrapped up in religion and tradition. Almost everyone took for granted that a pharaoh had to be a man. The very image of kingship, the crowns, the bull's tail, the curved false beard, the gesture of smiting enemies, had been male for over 1,000 years. There had been one or two women who ruled before, but only as rare stopgaps when no suitable man was available. This is what makes Hatshepsut so remarkable, and why she was so controversial. She did not just hold power for a while. She claimed the sacred office of king outright, and had to convince a deeply conservative country that a woman could be the guardian of Ma'at itself. Chapter 4. A Royal Daughter. Hatshepsut was born into the heart of this empire, the daughter of a warrior king. Her father was Thutmose I, a charismatic soldier pharaoh, remembered for campaigns that carried Egypt's armies deep into Nubia and far to the north. Her mother was his great royal wife, Amun, which made Hatshepsut a princess of the purest royal blood. That bloodline mattered enormously. In Egypt, the throne usually passed from father to son, ideally the son of the great wife. But the sons Amos bore did not survive, and so the crown passed instead to a son of one of her father's secondary wives, a half-brother of Hatshepsut named Thutmose II. Following royal custom, Hatshepsut was married to this half-brother, becoming queen of Egypt while still very young. Together they had a daughter, Neferur, but no surviving son. Hatshepsut would later claim that her father had always intended her to rule, a claim most historians think she invented to justify what came later. What is certain is that, by birth, no one in Egypt could match the royal blood in her veins. Chapter 5. God's Wife of Amun. Before she was ever called king, Hatshepsut held another title that gave her real power, God's Wife of Amun. Amun was the great god of Thebes, in time worshipped as the king of the gods and the hidden force behind creation. His temple at Karnak was vast and fabulously wealthy, and the woman who served as the god's earthly wife stood at the center of its rituals. The role had begun as an honor for a king's wife or daughter, but by the new kingdom, it had grown into something far more substantial. The god's wife took part in the most important temple ceremonies, commanded estates and income, and moved among the most powerful priests in the land. For Hatshepsut, it was a training ground in religion, ritual, and politics, all at once. Holding this office mattered later in ways she could not yet have known. It tied her name and her person directly to Amun, the very god whose blessing made a pharaoh legitimate. When the moment came to reach for the throne, that sacred bond would become one of her sharpest tools. Chapter 6. Regent for a Child King. Then her husband died. Thutmose II reigned only a short time before his death, around 1479 BCE, and the throne passed, yet again, to the son of a secondary wife. This boy was Thutmose III, Hatshepsut's stepson and nephew. He would one day become one of the greatest warrior pharaohs in all of Egyptian history. But at his father's death, he was far too young to rule, a child described in one inscription as a hawk still in the nest. What happened next was, at first, entirely normal. When a pharaoh was a child, it was accepted practice for a royal woman to act as regent, governing in his place until he came of age. As the boy's stepmother and the senior queen, Hatshepsut took on that role almost automatically. For the first years, everything followed tradition. The young Thutmose III was recognized as king from the very start, shown performing royal duties, while Hatshepsut stood beside him as a dutiful queen and regent. No one could have guessed how far she was about to step beyond that role. Chapter 7. The Queen Who Became King. Somewhere around the 7th year of the boy's reign, perhaps earlier, Hatshepsut did something no woman in living memory had dared. She had herself crowned, not as regent, not as queen, but as full pharaoh of Egypt. She took the 5 royal names of a king, including a new throne name, Matkar, and ruled as a monarch in her own right. Why she crossed that line, we cannot know for certain, and honest history must admit it. Older writers painted her as a scheming, power-hungry stepmother who stole a boy's throne. But many modern scholars read the evidence differently. A political crisis, perhaps a threat from a rival branch of the royal family, may have made it necessary for her to seize the kingship outright to protect it, even, possibly, to protect it for Thutmose III himself. Crucially, she did not get rid of him. He remained her co-ruler in name, and in time the commander of her armies. But for now, Egypt had something it had almost never had before, a woman who was king. Chapter 8. Born of a god. A king who broke the rules so boldly needed powerful reasons to be obeyed, and Hatshepsut set about building them in stone. Her most striking move was to claim that she was, quite literally, the daughter of a god. On the walls of her great temple, she had carved a series of scenes telling the story of her divine birth. In this account, the god Amun took the form of her father, Thutmose III, and came to her mother, the queen, who awoke to a wonderful fragrance and knew she was in the presence of a god. From that union, the reliefs say, Hatshepsut was conceived, making her not merely a royal daughter, but a child of Amun himself, destined to rule. She reinforced the message in other ways, showing her earthly father naming her his successor, and claiming the god had foretold her reign through an oracle. We should read these as royal propaganda, not as history, but they were brilliantly chosen. By rooting her right to rule in Amun, the very source of a pharaoh's legitimacy, she made challenging her look like challenging the gods. Chapter 9. Pharaoh in a king's regalia. Walk into one of Hatshepsut's temples, and you might not realize at first that you are looking at a woman. In her early images, she appears as a queen, with a female body and a woman's dress. But after her coronation, she had herself shown more and more as a male king, broad-chested, in a king's kilt and crowns, and, wearing the curved ceremonial false beard, that was part of a pharaoh's official costume. This was not a disguise, and it is important to get this right. Egyptian kingship came with a fixed set of symbols that had always been male, and, by adopting them, Hatshepsut was declaring, in the only visual language Egypt had, "I am Pharaoh." Her people knew perfectly well. She was a woman, her very name announced it. The inscriptions often kept feminine word endings, producing phrases that read astonishingly, as His Majesty herself. So when you see her with a false beard and a king's body, you are seeing the historical record exactly as she designed it, a woman claiming the sacred office of king, in the timeless regalia of that office. Chapter 10. A reign of peace and plenty. For all the drama of how she took power, the reign that followed was, by the standards of the age, a remarkable success, calm, wealthy, and creative. Hatshepsut ruled for around 2 decades, and most of those years were peaceful. Rather than spending Egypt's strength on constant war, she poured it into trade, building, and the arts. The wealth was real and visible. Gold came from the eastern deserts and from Nubia to the south. Fine stone was quarried in great quantities. Cedar was shipped from the lands of the Levant, and ebony brought up from deeper Africa. With the country secure and prosperous, Hatshepsut could afford projects on a scale few pharaohs before her had attempted. There were still soldiers and campaigns into Nubia and the lands to the northeast, partly to guard Egypt's frontiers and uphold the tradition of the warrior king. But Hatshepsut's true monuments were not battlefields. They were temples, statues, obelisks, and a famous voyage of trade. Under her, the art of Egypt grew soft, delicate, and refined, shaping its style for generations to come. Chapter 11. The Expedition to Punt. Of all her achievements, the one Hatshepsut seems to have been proudest of was a sea expedition to a far-off land the Egyptians called Punt, a place of incense and marvels, probably on the coast of the Red Sea, perhaps in the region of modern Eritrea, or Somalia. No Egyptian ruler had mounted such a voyage there in centuries. Her fleet sailed south and returned in triumph, and she had the whole story carved in loving detail on the walls of her temple. The reliefs show the ships being loaded with treasures, heaps of myrrh, precious ebony, and ivory, gold, eye cosmetic, exotic animals such as apes and panthers, and, most prized of all, living myrrh trees, their roots packed in baskets to be replanted in Egypt. An inscription boasts that never had the like been brought to any king. Those transplanted trees, set in the temple gardens, are among the first recorded attempts in history to move living trees from one country to another. The Punt expedition was trade, spectacle, and royal glory all at once, proof of a reign rich enough to reach the ends of the known world. Chapter 12. Deir, el-Bahri, Holy of Holies. Hatshepsut's greatest monument still rises today against a wall of golden cliffs across the Nile from Thebes. It is her memorial temple at Deir el-Bahri, and she gave it a name that means Holy of Holies, Dijezer Dijeru. Many regard it as one of the most beautiful buildings of the entire ancient world. Unlike the heavy, fortress-like temples of some pharaohs, hers seems to grow out of the mountain itself. A long ramp climbs through a series of broad terraces and colonnades, rising step by step toward the cliff face, where her shrine was cut into the living rock. The lower courts once held pools and gardens planted with fragrant trees, some carried home from Punt. Its walls were a gallery of her reign, the divine birth scenes, the Punt expedition, rows of statues showing her as king and in the guise of Osiris, god of resurrection. Later pharaohs admired the spot so much that they chose to be buried in the valley just beyond it, the place we now call the Valley of the Kings. Hatshepsut built, quite literally, to last forever. Chapter 13. Obelisks for Amun. Hatshepsut also left her mark on the great temple of Amun at Karnak, the religious heart of Egypt, with monuments built to astonish. Chief among them were her obelisks, tall, slender spikes of pink granite, their tips once sheathed in gleaming gold to catch the first light of the sun. The scale was staggering. Each of her tallest obelisks stood around 100 feet high and weighed in the region of 450 tons, cut in a single piece from the quarries at Aswan far to the south. She had the journey itself recorded in carvings, the giant stones lashed to an enormous barge, and towed down the Nile by a fleet of ships rowed by hundreds of oarsmen. Raising them upright, with the technology of the Bronze Age, was a feat of engineering and organization. One of those obelisks still stands at Karnak today, more than 3,000 years later, among the tallest in Egypt. On another, Hatshepsut left words wondering what people in years to come would say of what she had done. A rare human glimpse of a ruler thinking about her own legacy. Chapter 14. Senimut and the Court. No ruler governs alone, and Hatshepsut surrounded herself with capable officials. The most famous of them was a man named Senimut, who rose from fairly humble origins to become one of the most powerful figures at her court. He began as tutor and steward to her daughter, Neferuer, and his influence soared once Hatshepsut took the throne. Senimut gathered an extraordinary number of titles, by some counts more than 90, the grandest of which put him in charge of the building, works and estates of Amun at Karnak. He is generally thought to have been the guiding mind, if not the actual architect. Behind her masterpiece at Deir el-Bahri, and he was allowed the rare honor of a fine tomb of his own nearby. For a long time writers assumed Senimut must have been Hatshepsut's secret lover, or even the real power behind a woman they refused to credit. Most scholars today reject both ideas as gossip and as a serious underestimation of Hatshepsut herself. What the evidence shows is a brilliant servant of an able and trusting king. Chapter 15. Death and the Rise of Thutmose III. All the while, the boy king had been growing up. Thutmose III was not a prisoner during Hatshepsut's reign. He was being shaped into a soldier. She gave him command of Egypt's armies, and he proved himself an outstanding general. The man later ages would nickname the Napoleon of ancient Egypt for his string of victories. Around 1458 BCE, after roughly 20 years on the throne, Hatshepsut died. She was probably in her late 40s or 50s. An examination of a mummy, believed to be hers, suggests she may have died from an infection following the extraction of a tooth. An ordinary, painful end for so extraordinary a life, though, as we shall see, even the identity of that body is debated. With her death, Thutmose III at last became sole pharaoh of Egypt. He went on to a long and glorious reign of conquest, extending Egypt's empire further than ever before. For a time, Hatshepsut's monuments still stood, and her name endured. The strange campaign to wipe her from memory had not yet begun. Chapter 16. The Erasing of a Name. Years after Hatshepsut died, someone set out to erase her. Across Egypt her images were attacked, her face and figure chiseled from temple walls, her royal cartouches scratched out, her statues smashed and tumbled into pits. To the Egyptians, this was a terrible thing, for they believed a person lived on only as long as their name was spoken. Whoever did this was trying to make Hatshepsut, the king, disappear. For a long time, the story seemed obvious. Surely Thutmose III, resentful at the stepmother who had overshadowed him, had taken his revenge the moment she was gone. It made a gripping tale, but careful study has overturned it, and honesty requires saying so. Archaeologists noticed that the destruction did not begin right after her death at all. It seems to have started some 20 years later, near the end of Thutmose III's own long reign. That timing makes hot personal revenge unlikely. Most scholars now think the motive was political, to tidy the official record, so the throne appeared to pass straight from father to son, and perhaps to make sure no future woman could point to Hatshepsut and follow her example. Chapter 17. Brought back to light. So thorough was the erasure that for more than 3,000 years Hatshepsut was, in effect, lost. Later Egyptian king lists skipped her. Her temples were credited to other rulers, her name went unspoken. The woman who had ruled as pharaoh slipped almost entirely out of history. Her rediscovery came slowly through the patient work of Egyptologists. In the 1820s, the great decipherer of hieroglyphs, Jean-François Champollion, stood puzzled inside her temple at Deir el-Bahri, unable to square inscriptions that spoke of a female ruler with statues that looked male. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, excavation by excavation, scholars pieced her story back together, and in 1903, her tomb in the Valley of the Kings was opened. The most dramatic and most disputed chapter came in 2007, when a team led by the Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass announced that a long-known, unidentified royal mummy was Hatshepsut. The clue, they said, was a single tooth in a labeled box bearing her name, which appeared to match a gap in the mummy's jaw. It was a striking claim, but not everyone was convinced. Chapter 18. What the evidence can and cannot say. The 2007 identification is a good example of how real history works, and why a careful book should not overstate it. The case rested on linking an unwrapped royal mummy to a tooth stored in a wooden box, inscribed with Hatshepsut's name. The match supported by medical scans. Supporters pointed out that the body was female, of about the right age, and found in the right place. But respected scholars urged caution, and still do. Catherine Rowerig of the Metropolitan Museum, among others, noted plainly that the evidence was not conclusive, and that further study was needed. A tooth in a box is suggestive, not certain proof, so the truthful position is this: the mummy may well be Hatshepsut, and many accept it, but the identification remains debated rather than settled. That uncertainty is not a weakness in her story. It is the honest texture of studying a life lived 35 centuries ago. We know a great deal about Hatshepsut from her own monuments, far more than about most ancient figures. Yet, as one of her biographers put it, she is like an iceberg. Much is visible, and much remains hidden beneath. Chapter 19. What we really know. So who was Hatshepsut, once the legends and the guesswork are gently set aside? The firm ground is impressive enough. She was a royal daughter of Egypt's new kingdom, who, around 1479 BCE, became regent for her young stepson, and then took the unprecedented step of having herself crowned full pharaoh. She ruled for about 2 decades, in her own right, as king. Her reign was largely peaceful and strikingly prosperous. She legitimized her rule through religion and art, the divine birth reliefs, the regalia of a male king, and she left behind monuments of lasting beauty: the temple at Deir el-Bahri, towering obelisks at Karnak, and the famous trading expedition to Punt. Long after her death, her name was erased, most likely for political reasons, and only modern scholarship brought her back. What is legend or unproven? That her father openly named her heir, the exact reason she seized the throne. Even the certainty of her mummy, this book has flagged as such. The achievement, though, is real. Hatshepsut showed that a woman could hold the highest, most sacred office in the land and rule it well. That is why, in the end, she could not be forgotten. A note on history and sources. Writing about a ruler who lived around 3,500 years ago means weighing different kinds of evidence and being honest about what is certain and what is not. Much of what we know about Hatshepsut comes from her own monuments, especially the carved walls of her temple at Deir el-Bahri, which are magnificent, but were created to glorify and justify her, and so must be read with care. Several of the most colorful elements of her story are flagged in this book as legend or interpretation. Her claim that her father, Thutmose III, openly named her his heir, and the divine birth story in which the god Amun fathered her, are royal propaganda rather than plain fact. Exactly why she took the throne, naked ambition, or a political crisis that forced her hand, is debated. This book follows the many modern scholars who lean toward the second view. While admitting the truth is uncertain, it is also important to show her depiction truthfully. After her coronation, Hatshepsut had herself shown as a male king, in the Nemes headcloth, royal kilt, and ceremonial false beard. This was not cross-dressing or an attempt to fool anyone. Her people knew she was a woman, and her inscriptions often kept feminine word endings. It was the only visual language Egypt had for the sacred office of king, which had always been held by men. This book shows that regalia as the historical record, not as an anachronism. The later erasure of her name was long blamed on the personal revenge of Thutmose III. More recent study, reflected here, shows the destruction began about 20 years after her death, late in his reign, which points to political and dynastic motives rather than hatred. The 2007 identification of her mummy, based on a tooth in an inscribed box, is widely reported, but as scholars such as Catherine Rovrig of the Metropolitan Museum have cautioned, remains not conclusive. This book never invents quotations or puts words into the mouths of real people. The few quoted phrases are drawn from ancient inscriptions, or from named modern scholars, as reported in the sources below. Useful and reputable starting points include the Encyclopaedia Britannica, the World History Encyclopedia, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, National Geographic, and Smithsonian Magazine. This book paraphrases its sources and does not invent or quote at length any words attributed to Hatshepsut or other real people. Illustrations in this book are artistic interpretations created with the assistance of artificial intelligence image generation tools. They are not photographs, historical portraits, or verified contemporary depictions of any person. No painted lifetime portrait of Hatshepsut survives in the modern sense. All depictions of her here are therefore necessarily interpretive, informed by authentic 18th dynasty statues and reliefs about griot. Griot brings world history to life through striking, carefully researched illustrated stories. Its empires, its thinkers, and its turning points for curious readers everywhere. Copyright 2026. Published independently via Griot.